Welcome back. Welcome back. Glad to have you here today. You are listening to a podcast to answer your questions on addiction, recovery, and mental health, presented by Wiseman Method Opioid Treatment Specialists. Claire Wiseman, David Livingston, and myself, and I'm Dwight Hurst, are joining today to talk about the second part of our two-part conversation that had to do with enabling. Last episode, we talked about enablement as it applied to the parent-child relationship and addiction. Today, we're going to be talking about how do we break it down and define what is enabling and what do we do about it and how do we avoid it as it comes to our own relationships with our partners. We've been talking mostly when we give examples, we've been talking about parent-child relationships, but there's kind of a different wrinkle to partnerships, right? If people are spouses or romantic partners, sometimes they live together, sometimes they may not. In some cases, even divorced partners will still be involved with somebody's recovery because it affects the kids or whatever. So in those partnership type relationships, do you feel like there's different wrinkles to what is or isn't enabling or how to make those decisions?
I think that the main difference there is when you're talking about a partner or, a wife, a husband, you have, first responsibility, obviously, if you have minor children, to the safety of the home, to the safety of others. So there is another, layer to your decision because now you're dealing with, children that depends on your decisions to feel safe and cared for. And obviously you can affect their future as well.
Sort of different criteria to that question of are we good under the same roof?
Correct. It's not are we good? Are we safe?
Wow.
Sometimes we're not good, but we can get better. And we can work it, to, again, reach a healthier space. But are we safe today under the same roof? Is this damaging everybody involved, especially the children? Are we being irresponsible and putting them at risk? So there are different layers, I think, when there's minors involved that there isn't when you are a parent or somebody not living with the person. And then, if there is no children involved, then I think things get a little more, things are a little easier. Decisions are a little less risky because now you're really talking about you and somebody else. There's less barriers between. Obviously, there's always a consideration to others, and I think that is in any relationship. I think that is part of emotional maturity is learning to consider other people. But that's my thought between the parents and a partner. What do you think, David?
You're trying to think about the well-being of a family and the well-being of an individual. And, you've got to just look at everything like you're saying, Claire. And then it's hard to talk about these things in generalities, as I keep saying, but yeah, in general, if you're talking about, and it's different between kids and a partner, and, it also depends on the vulnerabilities of everybody involved, how vulnerable are, and how much can people handle? And there's a lot of things that have to be assessed.
I think for the patient themselves as well, when it's a parent, it's different than when it's your partner. Parent is kind of your root. I think it's a harder decision. It's a harder separation. I think there's a difference of a love to a child and a love to a partner, pretty much. So I think when you're dealing with your child, it's got to be much, much more difficult to make decisions where you because that's your job. That's naturally what your job is, to protect your child, period. That's not the job of a partner. Does that make sense?
I think it makes a lot of sense.
It does. And, and it depends on it depends on how vulnerable the child is and how vulnerable the partner is too. in terms of what you would or wouldn't do. And their resources, both internally and externally, and all kinds of factors. So I'm not sure how to even address it beyond that, unless we created scenarios. But it is a different relationship. But ultimately, you're trying to you want to evoke the adult part of the child and the partner. You want them to kind of step up with you and and begin to take responsibility. And when that's happening together, it's good.
I think we are forgetting another factor that often happens as well is people get used to crossing another line and another line. So what seems to somebody from the other side of not a healthy environment, or somebody not helping someone as they should, for them almost became the norm. Things evolve, and what shocked you 2 years ago today might be part of your day to day. So that is also an issue where, if we go back to where we started in this whole conversation, is being able to evaluate what's acceptable and not. And I think a lot of people lose sense of what that is. Families that I've spoken to 2 years ago, 5 years ago, what for them was shocking and absolutely not acceptable 2 years, 5 years ago, now became part of their day-to-day. And they don't see it as, you know what I'm saying? The big issue anymore.
Absolutely. And there's a type of enabling we don't often talk about. Especially if we are defining enabling as making relapse more likely, sometimes we inadvertently cling to a dynamic that we created in order to survive. So like you're saying, over the years, 3, 5, 10, 20 years of having an active addiction in my relationship with my partner, sometimes when they get sober, it's hard to adapt to that. And so we don't usually call this enabling, but it's the dynamic where someone might say, hey, don't tell me what to do with the kids. That's not your role. Well, it actually should become more my role if I'm getting sober. But how do we do that? And if it's like I give a tremendous amount of pushback, I might actually be enabling a relapse without meaning to, because I'm uncomfortable with you're threatening my survival strategy that I've come up with by living with you. And it's not even the person's fault. It's just part of that dynamic, I think. Because it's so important to protect the kids and to make sure the family still runs. And that's sometimes one of the harder parts for a partner. And honestly, one of the reasons why relationships really struggle when sobriety comes into the mix sometimes.
And sadly enough, I see that often, and the kids become broken as well. The kids do not know what's normal and what's not anymore, and what relationship for them, in their lifetime is something very different than in what it should be. It's a whole dynamic that if you allow it to, snowball on you, it just takes over every sense of your life.
And part of the empowering or positive enabling is actually working on things that are dynamics in relationships, because as the sobriety might come in and the blanket of the addiction that's protecting me against things goes away, then we'd have to deal with some of those things. And so like the opposite of enabling, actually, instead of pushing the person away, is like saying, okay, I need to work on myself and recovery from that survival. We need to work on our relationship, because chances are, even before addiction became a problem, there were probably some things that we could have benefited from working on. And especially if addiction is one of the ways my partner expresses their own symptoms of psychological stress, then they were probably under stress before. And we need to work on that to address the underlying problem as often comes up in treatment. What about this dynamic where people feel oftentimes that they are accused by professionals or other people? They go to maybe Al-Anon or they just talk to people and they're accused of enabling. Where do we think that accusation comes from? Does that come from people's own experience? Does it come from lack of experience only? Is it fear-based? What are some thoughts about that?
I personally believe it primarily comes from a lack of humility. It's very easy to point a finger or accuse somebody of something when, you have no knowledge of what they're really living in or through. So there is no rights and wrongs. There is, doing the best you can to live the best life, the healthier life you can. But the pointing finger, I don't think is supportive. I don't think is effective. I don't think it's productive. I think it's all the opposite.
Well, addiction recovery is like weight loss in this way. It's one of the areas of life that is very, very full of the problem of do it the way I did it. If you don't do it the way I did it, you're doing it wrong. and so people have experience and they sometimes pass that on, I think, too. As you put it, there's a lack of empathy there to say, let me stop and listen to a person and acknowledge that their situation might be different.
But then we go back to, our podcast in the beginning. People are looking at the addiction. They're not looking at the person. Addiction is a symptom. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have a heart. It doesn't have blood running through its veins. It's just a condition. There is a person behind the addiction. And that's what you should be looking at. That's what you should be treating. When you treat the symptom, it's temporary.
Because we need boundaries and we need to hold ourselves responsible, and we need to be able to hold other people responsible, at least at times too. And at the same time, if you go too far in that, you can overwhelm people, you can alienate them, you can create conditions that lead towards compulsivity or relapses or things like that. So it's a balance, and how do you balance that process is, it just takes a lot of thinking and really, and this is one of my gripes with what's happened in the field of addiction and in the field of psychology in general, is it's so behaviorally oriented that everything's just about the behavior, get sober, stay sober, so forth. That's all. There's a benefit to that, and there's and certainly behaviors are critical, but the ability to think and develop your ability to understand and to reflect on what your needs are, to be able to sustain the tensions and stay in things long enough to find creative solutions and hang in there and develop in that way. That's really the goal from my perspective. It isn't just, it's to develop along the way. So if you develop along the way, you will have a capacity for more creative solutions to everything always. That's the goal. So instead of just seeing one possible, way of coping, you can think, all right, well, this isn't working. I'm not doing this. Well, what else can I do? How can I hustle? I'll call this person. I'll do that. I can, and having a multitude of ways.
I know some therapists now, they feel like codependence has become shorthand for blaming someone, unless it's really well defined, to say, people like to say, what are the elements of what we used to call codependence in the relationship and label them for what they are. Whereas oh, you're codependent. Okay, great. So it's my fault. Gotcha.
Yeah. I don't even know what it means. Yeah, I mean, I guess I do in general. But,
no, but that's the problem. I think it's not well defined.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think the inability to stand on your own would leave you vulnerable for potentially unhealthy dependency, where you didn't feel like if you're in a situation that is not good for you or worse, you could leave and you could, and people do get in that, and life's complicated, and families and, relationships develop along all kinds of different avenues, financially and in other ways. And so people at times are vulnerable, and how to get out of that and how to manage that and how to, so I agree with you. I never use that word. I think you've got to break these things down and understand if people are feeling stuck or they feel vulnerable in ways, you have to get into what that is and what can help it.
We're going to leave it there for today. I feel like we were able to really get into two very important parts of that question of what is enablement, how do we avoid it, and what are some things we can do instead. If you have questions, please email us, info@opiates.com. Check out our website, opiates.com, or go on Twitter @opiates. I'd love to hear the questions that you have. We really enjoy the outpouring of reaching out that we're getting from listeners who want their specific questions answered. Claire and David and myself, we find that we get a lot out of digging into things that interest and fascinate you out there. And thanks for all of the feedback that we've been getting. We're glad to be able to be helpful. This show is a production of Pop Color Productions. You can learn more about Pop Color Productions and start your podcast at popcolor.net. Our music is the song Medical by Clean Mind Sounds. For Claire Wiseman and David Livingston, I've been Dwight Hurst. Glad to be here with y'all. Please keep asking questions. If you ask questions, you get answers. Answers lead to hope. We'll see you next time.